So this week, I've still been reading Ron Blue's book, Master Your Money. It's been really good. I have not been as diligent in reading as I would have liked to, but this is a really good chapter that I've read recently. And so in this chapter, he's talking about the myths of inflation. And so he lays out 4 key arguments that he just wants to provide some extra thought into. Not necessarily that some of these parts of these thoughts are fine, just provide some clarification on, what is inflation and how do we need to think about it. So the first one, the first myth he talked about, he said, buy now because it will cost more later. And he said, in essence, yes, this may be true, but sometimes that causes us to buy things that we really don't need for the idea that it's going to cost more later. And he says, it's not always the case, that something is going to cost more later. Yes, it might, and in likelihood cost more in the future. But just because of that, if you don't need it, then it doesn't make it a good purchase. Just buying something now because it's going to go up in price. If you don't need it, then you don't need it. What his kind of point. His second thing that he talks about is, or the second myth is that you should always borrow to buy. And so what he kind of clarifies that is he says that kind of gives, there's some assumptions behind that thought. And the first one is that, whatever you're investing in, that thing's going to grow. Like if you're putting if you're borrowing to get something, then hopefully that thing's going to appreciate in value in the long run rather than depreciate. Because he says sometimes we borrow, thinking that you're going to beat inflation, but we're buying something that's, it's not going to grow. It's
right.
Stuff that's actually depreciating in value. And then he basically said that the return on you're getting on it is higher than inflation. So that's the other assumption. So not necessarily always. So maybe look at that before you jump into, I need to borrow because of inflation. Let's look at the returns you're getting, before you jump into that. And then he said, the third myth is you can never accumulate enough, for retirement. That inflation just makes it this ever increasing goal that you can never get to. So if things keep becoming more and more expensive, then you're never going to be able to get to that point where you can have enough for retirement. And so he debunks that with some math saying, yes, you can get enough, returns. And he did the math kind of breaking down, and he even had some formulas in here that you could use to calculate your own rates. What would your number need to be? And so what kind of rate of return would you need to get? And so he kind of had those cool resources in this. And then the fourth thing he said is the rate of inflation is standard for everyone. He says, that's a pretty common myth, but he says, if you really do the math, it affects everybody differently. So some people, they may get hit pretty hard, if inflation keeps going up, but other people maybe don't see it as much. So he's like, it's kind of depends on each case. And so it definitely does change the math a little bit, for each person. So he says, don't take it as a one sum, like, inflation's going up, that's going to always affect me. It may affect you a little bit better or worse. We don't know for sure. So do a little bit of research on that. And then his kind of final thought that he gave is usually, he said, usually inflation is good for the lender. So he says it's good to be kind of in that space where you're investing rather than having a bunch of debts. He says usually that's the way. It depends what your debts are in, but he says usually the people that come out on top are the people that are lending the money rather than the ones borrowing money.
Right.
But he kind of outlines some good ways that we can safeguard against inflation. So it's a pretty good chapter, very practical.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that was pretty cool.
Yeah. So I've been reading a classic, The Millionaire Next Door. Anybody that's interested in accumulating wealth of any kind, even if you don't think you can become a millionaire, you need to read this book. It's great inspiration. It's very old. I say old. I mean, it was a study done in '96, I believe, and it's old to me. That's as old as I am. So some of the statistics you may think, these are kind of a little outdated, but in finance, things tend to hold true throughout the years. And so it's a classic. It's really good. But the chapter I was looking at it's called Frugal, Frugal, Frugal. And it says they live well below their means. So one of the main topics that's constant throughout the book is millionaires live below their means. And it debunks the whole myth of millionaires tend to just build all this wealth. They spend a bunch of money. They're always driving Ferraris. They always have big, big houses. That's not always the case. That's the celebrities you see on TV. That's a very small percentage of who millionaires are. That's in the title, The Millionaire Next Door. It's talking about just that guy that looks normal. You never thought he's just driving a Crown Vic or a Honda Civic, and they got a net worth of $1 million. So that's really what this is talking about. And those people still live below their means. And it's always interesting to me because it's such a simple concept that a lot of us tend to forget to live below our means. Businesses do this all the time. The whole point of a profit is to have more come in than go out. So why are our lives any different? But we tend to not think about that. We tend to spend everything that we make. And then we go, well, I have nothing. I have nothing to invest. So the whole point of this chapter is you don't have to make a ton of money. You still need to focus on that income. You still need to work on trying to build your career. But really, it's that margin where you get frugal enough where you have some extra sitting aside to where you can invest, save, and do things that help build wealth. And that's really what the secret recipe is for the everyday millionaire. And of course, there's always, those outliers that you see on TikTok and Instagram and TV saying, hey, I did this crazy investment. I started a hedge fund and I'm a multimillionaire. It happens, but that doesn't happen a lot. The typical millionaire is just a person next door who's making a typical salary, living below their means and in saving and investing. And then one day woke up, got a thing in the mail that said, hey, your 401k just hit $1 million. And they were floored just as much as you are, or I am when you see something like that. So it's a great book. I really recommend it. I read this I try to read this as much as I can, at least once a year, but more for reference. There's so much statistics, a lot of data. So a lot of stuff that I like to reference and look back on, and sometimes just remind myself why I do what I do, and the whole fact that I could become a millionaire one day. And the recipe is really just right here. So
yeah, that's really good.